It's actually, in many respects, it's far simpler to develop in Japan than it is to develop in a Western country.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to episode 74 of the show. Thanks for joining me. Got a great show coming up for you today. Sharing a story I'm sure you are going to enjoy. Certainly one we haven't discussed before on the show, and I think you're really going to like it. Anyway, how have you been? How are your projects going? I'm well. Still in lockdown in Melbourne. Have to say I'm pretty bored of it all and looking forward to some changes. But who knows when that will be. Anyway, work continues slowly at my site. The drainage people are on site at the moment, digging trenches and installing big pipes and pits around the place, which is great to see. Check out the Property Developer Podcast Facebook page for a quick update video that I shot, and you can see what's happening on site. On the sales front, we're seeing a bit of a surge of interest at the moment, which I think is due to pent-up demand and people wanting to act after some lockdown restrictions were relaxed a little, allowing private inspections to happen for real estate. Plus, the home builder grant is due to expire in a few months, so that may be creating some urgency for buyers to act and take advantage of the money on offer. It's good to see some activity back in the market, and I hope it continues. On my other project, I'm assessing what to do as there is a moratorium on evictions in Victoria until March next year, so we cannot get our property vacant until the middle of next year, which has an impact on our planned timelines. It's certainly an interesting time for the property industry. Hopefully government incentives and support measures continue to be rolled out to help keep the sector viable and vibrant. Now, if you are interested in learning how to develop property, then remember we have the mentoring program that's available to help guide you through the process of becoming a developer. It's a great program that will teach you lifelong skills and help you unlock value and wealth from real estate. If you'd like to know more, then email me, justin@propertydeveloperpodcast.com. Okay, let's get on to today's guest. I can't wait to bring this to you. This is a story I'm sure you're going to love. This discussion is a reminder about the many different ways that you can become a developer, and it doesn't even need to be in your own country. So I'm speaking with Ruskin McLennan, who has spent decades doing real estate projects in Japan. Ruskin started off tackling a ski resort project, learned a few hard lessons, and then got heavily involved with land subdivision, which he is still actively doing today. There were so many questions I had for Ruskin when I was talking to him. Like, how does a guy from central New South Wales end up doing property deals in Japan? Why would you develop in Japan? How difficult is it to do developments there? Who are the buyers? And so many more questions. This is a fascinating discussion, one that I really enjoyed and I'm sure you will too. So let's get straight into it and see what Ruskin would eat until he was sick.
Mangoes. I love a fresh mango. And I can eat, I love all the different flavors at the different times of year. So I had to, I do love a little bit of chocolate, but mango is definitely my favorite food. So I'd have to say mangoes.
And which a particular mango breed?
I love, there's mangoes from all around the world. They come as far from Mexico now, but those Queensland mangoes, when they come into season at the beginning of the summer, to me, have just got the right texture and an incredible amount of sweetness that I think, I just get, I love the seasonality of that fruit, and just the way it tastes different throughout the year. So it's got to be an early summer Queensland mango.
Oh, well, being a former Queenslander myself, I can appreciate the joy of the mango, and having grown up in the tropics, eating them all the time, they are a pretty special fruit. Definitely one of my favorites. All right. Well, it's good to know that you're a mango lover, and we might get to whether they have mangoes in Japan, because we'll get to your story shortly about how you ended up in Japan. But you got a bit of an interesting story to tell, so give us a bit of a background about how you got into property, and then we'll move into your story about doing some developing and real estate in Japan.
I grew up with real estate. My father was a pharmacist, and he invested in some local real estate. And so I can always remember following what he did back in the day, some developing and subdividing. I grew up on the Central Coast, just north of Sydney, and there were some opportunities up there. So I saw my father get involved in that fledgling market back in the 70s and 80s when I grew up. So I was always fascinated with it. And I did a degree in land economics at the University of Western Sydney. And I really enjoyed that the practical side of economics. And that was a fantastic course. And I made some great friends during that course who went into all different areas of real estate. And I was, to this day, we still do business together and we still meet on a regular basis. And some of those guys are overseas working in Dubai. Some are working in residential development in Western Sydney, and some are working in government. So, fantastic course.
Just quickly, what would be the main thing that you reckon you took out of a land economics course?
Valuation. Obviously, the course focuses on valuation, but it also focuses on marketing, on accounting. So it's like a very practical economics degree. But really, the valuation side of that course was really valuable to me. Is just sitting down and evaluating an investment on a very rational basis. The cash flow, NPVs, all those sorts of things. That's what I really enjoyed about that course.
All right. So you graduated top of the class and left uni, and then what?
I definitely didn't graduate top of the class. And I worked for Wilson Parking for 5 years, and that was that was an interesting way to get into the commercial side of real estate. I did a couple of years working out at Sydney Airport as well in the commercial side there. And then I went overseas and I lived in Prague for 3 years, and I was doing real estate acquisitions for a big car company over there. And they were sending me around the world, but mostly around Europe, looking at sites to purchase or to lease, and the car market. So that was a fantastic 3 years of education.
So you drove a
Skoda? I did drive a Skoda a little bit, but it was in the car business. It was a very exciting time. There's a guy who's on the BAW Rich List, a guy called Tony Denny. I worked with him for 3 years, and he started a chain of used car dealerships in Eastern Europe and expanded that greatly and did very, very well out of it. And he's also a mentor to me to a certain degree. So that was a fun time working in Eastern Europe, and I was. So that really led, after I left Eastern Europe, I went, by that stage, I'd been skiing in Japan for 3 or 4 years. So I first went to Japan in 1998 as a keen skier and snowboarder, and there were very few people there in 1998, and I continued to ski there pretty much, up until the present day, of course. But going to Japan in 1998 to ski and snowboard was a little bit like going to Bali in 1972 as a surfer. There were very few foreigners there. The snow conditions were very good. It was a little bit like discovering a gem. I certainly wasn't the first person to ski in Japan, but I was one of the sort of early people. So I was, I've seen it grow substantially over the last 23 years. As a skiing destination and a holiday destination and a tourist destination. So during that time I was in Eastern Europe, I was able to, I made my first investments in Japan. And I bought my first block of land in Japan in 2004 for $30,000. So that's how I just really, not as an investment, really just as, because I'd been going there for 4 or 5 years just to build a house. I thought that'd be it was certainly a place I wanted to continue to ski. And there was just some very early development happening in that time in 2004. So there was a couple of local guys who were building houses. So I got those guys to put some designs together for me to build a house. And that's how I got involved in the Japanese property market in 2004.
And so did you build the house?
No, I didn't.
What happened?
Well, what happened was I was offered a partnership in a development site.
In Japan?
So in Japan, in Nissiko. And I could see how quickly the value of that block of land that I'd purchased in 2004 had increased. And a good friend of mine was the biggest inbound tourist operator, and still is to this day, into the ski resorts in Japan, a guy called Pete Murphy, who runs a company called Ski Japan. So Pete and I and another investor partnered up, and we purchased a site. And we were going to...
Sorry to interrupt. Can you just give us a bit of a flavour of what that site looked like? Size, sort of location,
that site,
what you planned on doing?
was right at the base of the ski hill. So it was classics. It was ski developing 101. It was ski in, ski out property. It was about 1,400 square meters. And at that stage in Nissiko, there were no building regulations, and you could build really whatever you wanted to. It was classified as forest. It was before they put any zoning together on that site. So we'd three investors. We'd bought the site. It cost us $1 million. So instead of building the house, I invested in that property, and we employed a project manager to put a development application in on the site. So we'd engaged architects, and at that stage, I was still living in Eastern Europe. So we bought the site, settled it, employed a project manager, and then were successful in getting a DA to build a 7-story building at the base of the ski hill in Nissiko.
So the apartments?
Apartments, yeah, 36 apartments. Long story short, in 2006, we sold that site to Consolidated Property through Don O'Rourke, through his company, and
past guest on the show.
Yeah. So Don, we were happy with that arrangement at that stage because we were struggling with finance in Japan at that stage, and Don was the right guy to take over the site. So he took over the site with the DA and completed the development, and it was a great success. It settled. The building was complete in September 2008, and it was mostly sold to the Consolidated database. So, the location, the design, it was a success. So that was, how I got to meet Don O'Rourke.
Well, the beauty of the podcast is that we can go with the long stories rather than the short ones. So can you fill in a little bit more detail about where you got caught up or what you learnt in that first development application, and maybe talk to us about what it's like getting a development application in Japan?
Getting a development application in Japan is really straightforward. But we were caught in an interesting conundrum at that stage, because when we put in our development application, we put in a development application in for a 7-story building. And after we'd put in the development application, they brought in a series of rules in Nissiko after our development application that only allowed 6-story buildings. So we had some conflict with the locals on the height of the building. And we also had some conflict in the partnership group about the height of the building. One of the partners wanted to lower the building, and one wanted to continue with the design that we had. We thought we'd be able to get finance through the builders in Japan, which, if you're a big organisation, you often can. But the truth is that that was going to require a lot more capital than we'd initially thought, because we were quite small developers, and that was our first development. So it was a little bit of a, we were learning, the hard way, I guess. And Don came along at the right time in 2006 after we'd got our approvals through, and made an offer to the three partners that we all accepted. And that was a way for us to move on. And one of the majority partner in that development went on to establish a very successful development company in Japan, a guy called Jonathan Martin, who's got a company called Nissiko. And Nissiko right now are just finalising a big 100-unit development in an emerging resort close to Nissiko called Rizutsu. And that's one of many buildings that Nissiko have gone on to do. So, those guys were the right guys to do a development with. It just wasn't the right timing for our partnership. My other partner was Pete Murphy, who runs a company called Ski Japan. And Ski Japan continues to be a very big player in the ski business in Japan. After that development, I realised that my strong suit wasn't really in developing, and it was more in the agency side of things. So we started a company in Pete Murphy and myself in 2006 called Nissiko Property, and that Nissiko Property, continues to be a success to this day. I sold out of my share in that company in 2011, and the guy who took over, a guy called Grant Mitchell, has taken Nissiko Property from strength to strength. So, it's I'm now started a new company called Peak Property. I left the market for a couple of years and then returned to the market, and I just have a Japanese partner, a guy called Kichi Nakagawa. And Kichi and myself just run our company, Peak Property, ourselves. We enjoy doing less transactions, but giving a more personalised service and having higher margins rather than having an office and staff. And we also have a business up there called Nissiko Listings, which is a consolidated listing website, which is a little bit like realestate.com. So we consolidate all the small agents together, and that gives those smaller agents a voice in the Nissiko market. And
so that's selling property. Is that what that company and you did?
We're selling, primarily at the moment. Peak sells property. As a side note to selling property through Peak, we've done some investment syndicates where I put some syndicates together to invest in property in the past on a small scale and recently on a larger scale. So I've got 8 investors together to purchase land in Rizutsu, a 6-hectare site in Rizutsu. And I've also purchased another 6-hectare site in a town called Kuchan, which is adjacent to Nissiko. It's about 10-minute drive from Nissiko. And I'll be, doing a subdivision there on my own in the next 3 to 4 years. I'm just jumping through all the hoops that goes with doing a subdivision in Japan at the moment.
So that's a land subdivision, and you just plan on selling off the blocks?
That's correct, yeah. So that's a 6-hectare site. So I purchased that site 2 years ago, and I'm just, dealing with my neighbours at the moment. There's some. We've just finished the survey and there's some land overlap. So I own some farmers' land and I've got to, I'm just negotiating with the farmer on a land swap at the moment. So we've just, that obviously takes a lot of time. So we're just going through that motion at the moment, which is probably a good thing, considering the state of the market at the moment.
Yeah. Can you give us a sense of the size of blocks that you'll cut them down to?
The size of the blocks will be somewhere between 350 to 660 square metres. Some of the blocks may be a little bit bigger than that. There'll be quite a lot of green space in the subdivision as well. and we'll be looking at the local market and the middle market. Most development in Japan is really aimed at the high end of the market. So the high, Nissiko, or I should say Nissiko, most development in Nissiko is really aimed at the high end of the market. And while we're talking about, Nissiko, we probably should talk about a little bit about the overview of Nissiko, because I'm sure there's some people listening to this podcast who've got no idea what, we're talking about when we talk about Nissiko.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I might give you a little bit of an overview of Nissiko. So Nissiko is located in the north of Japan on the North Island of Hokkaido. So I like to call it, it's a little bit like the Tasmania of Japan. It's quite undeveloped.
Is that meant to be a compliment, or we'll leave that to our listeners to decide?
Yeah, no, it is definitely a compliment. It's got none of the, I think that jokes about Tasmania aside, it's a beautiful, natural, cold place. And it's got all the best of Japanese culture, the great food, the lovely people. But it's a little less developed than the rest of Japan. So there's when you go up there, there's a lot of farming community, there's a lot of national park, there's a lot of space. So it's not as highly, densely populated as Honshu, the main island of Japan. And if you're a skier or a snowboarder, it's also a little bit colder than the rest of Japan, and it gets a lot of snow. So it snows 13 to 14 meters a year, which makes it one of the snowiest places on the planet. And the reason it gets so much snow is there's a thing up there called ocean effect snow. So what you've got is adjacent to Japan, you've got the greatest landmass in the world, that Asia-Russia landmass. And in winter, that's very, very cold. And that dry air travels, or that very dry, cold air travels from west to east. And the first thing that dry, cold air does, as it comes off Asia, is it hits the Sea of Japan, which is a very warm body of water. And that warm body of water, all of a sudden, it picks up all that moisture. Next thing it hits is Japan. And Japan's mountains, by world standards, are not particularly high, but and Nissiko's only at the top of Nissiko Mountain is only 1,300 meters above sea level, which as a ski resort is very low. But that very cold, very dry air hits those mountains around Nissiko, and it just drops snow. And it's that if you're a skier or a snowboarder, that in December, January, February, we get about 5 meters of snow per month. And if you're a skier and a snowboarder, that's, heaven on a stick. It just snows continually. It's not unusual for it to snow 2 or 3 weeks nonstop. And that means you just get, that beautiful, dry, deep, fluffy snow that you'll see on social media all through winter.
And can you just give us a sense of what it's like developing in Japan? I mean, my understanding was that they've been in the economic doldrums for decades or more. So does that influence property prices?
Nissiko and the area around it was famous in the 90s and in the 2000s for having the worst performing property market in all of Japan, because it was essentially a rural area. There was and it's quite a remote area. It's about 100 kilometres from the nearest international airport. The land prices were very, very depressed when we turned up. And so you could buy a block of land at the bottom of a ski hill for $30,000 like I did back in 2004. And then, developing by that stage, by about 2000, there'd been Westerners increasingly coming into Nissiko, and they'd struggled to find Western-style accommodation. So developing in Japan was a little bit tricky because of the language barrier, but there was a couple of, Western guys who'd been building in Japan for 15 or 20 years, and they realized the opportunity, and they came up to Japan and started offering property management services. Or project management services, more accurately. So what you could do is you could go in there, talk to one of the Western guys. They would go through the approval process for you. They wouldn't actually build the house, but they would project manage the house for you with some Japanese builders. The Japanese building process is really, from a Western perspective, is really good. It's really straightforward. With the building regulations that they have in Japan, as long as you comply with the building regulations, you'll get a building permit without any issue. And the architects know that, and the architects often work as project managers as well. So if you have purchased a block of land in Japan, and Japan has a system of title that's very similar to Australia, where they have a torrens title system. And in some respects, it's actually even more simple than purchasing land in Australia, because the property contracts are largely pro formas. So you just complete the pro forma. There's a local solicitor or scrivener, as they call them in Japan, who will arrange the conveyance for you. So you purchase your block of land, you go and see a local project manager. He prepares a design for you. He then takes that design to the local authorities. They approve it. He then project manages the builder. The builder will give you a set price, and he'll give you a finish date. And they will, unless you have any modifications after that, they will always build it on time, and they will always build it exactly, precisely to your specifications. So it's actually, in many respects, it's far simpler to develop in Japan than it is to develop in a Western country.
God, so many questions there. So just going back to getting a planning permit. So you said if you tick all the boxes with regards to whatever the code is, you get your permit. What about if you don't? Is there any variability or?
No, there is not. There are no shades of grey. And if you go into the planning department and they've got a big smile on their face, do you comply? Yes, we comply. Tick. Goodbye. Thank you. There's no shades of grey.
And is that a very long process?
It doesn't have to be a long process, and that's the beauty of planning in Japan. Sometimes the planning rules are a little bit silly and a little bit archaic, but there are no shades of grey.
And then sorry to interrupt. And then what about paying or the title in terms of, do you have to establish some kind of entity in Japan, or do you buy in your own name? What's the sort of legal side on that side? You can
buying a property in Japan is really straightforward. There's no foreign investment review board. You can purchase in a company name, you can purchase in your own name. The only thing they don't like you purchasing in a trust's name, but you can purchase a property in a company name that's associated with a trust. So buying a property in Japan is not really all that complicated, and there are Western English-speaking consultants and Western consultants who can guide you through the process.
And then earlier you mentioned about finance. What's funding like, getting development funding in Japan?
Development funding is really tough. Interestingly, back in 2008, 2009, you could get some funding from the Commonwealth Bank. And a lot of the early investors in Nissiko, who were mostly Australian, managed to get finance, get a mortgage on their properties in Japan with the Commonwealth Bank. They offered 300 mortgages, 2008, 2009, and then they closed that book and have never re-offered any mortgages. If you are married to a Japanese national, it is possible for you to get some financing, or it's easier for you to get financing. But if you're a foreigner and you're not married to a Japanese national, it is very, very difficult to get finance. Almost impossible to get financing in Japan. So the way that most people have got financing to build in Japan is by going and seeing their local bank in whatever domicile that might be. If you're in Australia, obviously it's talking to your local bank and getting a loan secured against your Australian property. So that's the way that most people have developed in Japan.
So basically,
but
you've got to fully fund it.
You do it. It's very much a cash development scenario.
Okay, and the land that you sell, who's generally your buyers for that? Are those locals, or is there a big international market?
For the first, when I first purchased my first block in 2004, I bought it through a Japanese agent, and he didn't speak any English. And we drove around, and he had a little book, and he pointed to a couple of blocks, and he was the only agent in town, and so I sort of chose a block, really in half an hour, and then and we agreed on a price, and I went to play golf, but it was a I realized pretty quickly and that there was an opportunity there to open an agency to guide people through the sales process, because numbers in Japan by that stage had really started to rise. So there's now a dozen foreign-owned or foreign-run agencies in the Nissiko area, and indeed now throughout Japan. So if you want to invest in Japan or in Nissiko or one of the other ski areas in Japan, there's mostly a Western or an English-speaking agent who can guide you through the process.
And then what's the market transparency like in terms of understanding values and transactions that are happening wherever you're looking?
That's a great question, Justin. The tricky thing about investing in Japan in real estate is the market is opaque. So there's no publication of prices that are paid in a particular area. There's no way that you can go into there's no way that you can investigate what your neighbour purchased your property for. You really only got the word of the local agent and people in the market. So you really need to research the market before you go into the market. And it does create a little bit of an advantage for those who really understand the market and really know the market.
And Ruskin, what about build costs in Japan? Is it cheap, expensive?
Build costs in Nissiko in Japan are a little more expensive than building in somewhere like Indonesia or Australia or the rest of Asia. You've got to build for winter and for earthquakes, and they've got a very structured building industry. So you obviously got to insulate the building and create a building that can withstand 15 metres of snow a year. So you're looking at about $3,000 per square metre to build a suburban style house, which is what most people do when they go up to Nissiko. And build costs are driven a little bit by the shortage of skilled labour, which has come about with the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. There's been a lot that sucked up a lot of labour, and also the reconstruction work associated with the 2011 earthquake. So that has led to a little bit of a shortage of builders in Japan or in Hokkaido. Build costs are a little higher.
Okay, and I wanted just to go back to finish off the economic discussion, because generally speaking, Japan has been economically depressed for a couple of decades now. But what you're saying is there's different parts of the country perform differently, particularly in relation to the property market?
Yeah, well, the Nissiko area and the area around the major ski resorts, and people have been developing in Nissiko now for about 20 years. In some of the other ski resorts on Honshu, they're just starting to develop now. So Nissiko is like a little island in Japan. Property prices have grown, very strongly in that area over the last 15 years. But it's very much driven by foreign investment rather than by local investment. So 99% of the buyers that I deal with are foreigners, mostly from Asia now, and to a lesser degree Australia. In the first 5 years I was in the real estate business up there, most of our buyers were Australian, but they gave way in 2008, 2009 to Asian investors. So a lot of Chinese investors, a lot of Chinese visitors, a lot of Hong Kong, a lot of Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia. The wealthy people from those Asian countries are really driving the Nissiko market. You've got to remember that that Sapporo, which is the gateway to Nissiko, is only 2 hours flight from Beijing, and only 5 hours from Hong Kong. So it's really accessible to the Chinese market.
And what's it like living? Would you say you live there? What's it like living there as a foreigner, and how are you viewed by the locals?
I lived in Nissiko between 2006 to 2011, and it's a great place to live. It's a cliche that we all use in ski resorts, but we say come for the winter, stay for the summer. So the winters are always great if you're a keen skier and snowboarder, but the summer is equally as good. There's a lot less people around. It's a very green and lush area. A lot of the ski areas that you see in Europe and in Australia are almost desert-like in the summer. But in Japan, it's very green and very lush. It still rains a lot. There's great golf courses up there. You're only 45 minutes drive to the beach. So there's what's also happening in Nissiko over the last 10 or 15 years is a lot of the foreigners who've come to Nissiko to drive the tourism market have stayed there. They have houses there. In summer, it's a great place to visit. Nissiko is really only a Western-driven economy for 3 months of the year, and that's December, January, February. For the rest of the year, it reverts very much to being a Japanese town, and it quietens down quite substantially, and you really return to nature. So there's a real lifestyle to living there, and that's a very attractive thing. So what we're seeing now is Nissiko is becoming a real lifestyle capital. You can, in summer, it's a great place to ride your mountain bike. You can take your mountain bike on the lifts now. It's a great place to ride your road bike. It's a great place to train. The beach is only 45 minutes away. So there's a real lifestyle associated with Nissiko, and that's really popular with Asian guests now. So we get a lot of Asian guests coming up in summer to go to central Hokkaido, in Furano in particular. So it's a real lifestyle destination. There's a lot of people moving to Nissiko for the lifestyle. And obviously because more and more people are working remotely, there's a lot of people who live and work in Nissiko remotely now, really just for the lifestyle.
And what's the view? What's the Japanese view of other people coming in or people living there? There must be some tension at times.
In winter, there's certainly some tension now. Nissiko, when I first came to Nissiko in 1998, there were 300 foreign visitors for the season. But now in the winter period, in December, January, February, Nissiko gets about 200,000 foreign visitors in a very short period of time. So the Japanese people, there's a real emphasis on, when you're in Japan, act like a Japanese person, be respectful. and occasionally the Westerners will upset that apple cart, but by and large, Japan are very good with tourists, and the tourist economy is really given the Japanese economy a shot in the arm. Japanese tourist numbers now are around 30 million per year. When I first came to Japan in 1998, there were only 4 million overseas guests to Japan. So tourism in Japan has really exploded particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. It's become a lot more accessible, largely because of the internet, and the internet is really good in Japan and it's really accessible. There's things like Google Translate. It's a lot easier with a mobile phone in your hand to get around in Japan. And people have realized that Japan is not as expensive as the rest of as people have made out in the past. The yen's not as strong as it used to be. So, it's a great place. If you're a tourist, it's a great place to travel. And that tourism infrastructure is so good. You've got the Shinkansen, the bullet train that, runs throughout Japan. So it's easy to get around. And one of the things that's driving development in the Nissiko area is a Shinkansen station, which is being built in Kuchan, which is that small town which is 10 minutes drive from Nissiko. So that will not be completed for another 10 years. So it's opening in 2030, but that's really going to drive tourism to the Nissiko area, so that means you can it'll take about 4 hours from Tokyo to Nissiko on the bullet train, and it'll also make other areas of Hokkaido much more accessible. That's one of the things that's really driven the real estate market in that area.
And I can't not ask you a question about food in Japan. What's your favourite food that you like to eat over there?
Oh God. I think that probably my personal favourite is soup curry, which is a Japanese curry that in winter is just perfect. It's just that beautiful blend of, lovely Japanese vegetables, a mild curry, often with a little bit of coconut in it, and with some rice on the side that you add to the curry. So it's just, I think that's going to be the next big Japanese food. When it's done well, it's delicious, particularly in winter.
So it's mangoes in the summer and then Japanese curry in the winter.
It is, yeah. I mean, of course, one of the big, Japan is, if you're a foodie, Japan's a perfect destination because every little restaurant takes great pride in the food that they produce. So it's very rare to get a bad meal in Japan.
And it's not just Japan that you've got property interests in. I think you've got other things that you're doing back in Australia.
I do a little bit of commercial real estate in Australia. And I have invested in Indonesia as well, in Lombok, with some friends of mine who I met in Nissiko, who've got a great development model in Lombok called in an area called Selong Selo, which is on the south coast of Lombok. Beautiful area, great beaches, beautiful sand, good waves as well. So I have invested in Indonesia as well.
So you're chasing the good times, basically, whether it's up in the mountains or down by the beach.
I think, I saw that growth that they were getting in Bali, and, I first went to Bali in the 80s as a surfer, and, I loved it from the moment that I got there, and I still love going to Indonesia, and I go there a couple of times a year if I can. And I do think Indonesia's got tremendous potential. And I missed the boat in Bali, so I was determined not to miss it in Lombok. And Lombok's certainly had its ups and downs, but I took my wife to Selong Balanik a couple of years ago because I wanted her perspective on it. as a non-surfer, and she loved it. So I do think Lombok's got some potential.
Yeah, and you've got, what did you say? You had some commercial properties somewhere in
I do.
New South Wales.
Yeah, on the Central Coast. I grew up on the Central Coast, and I own and manage some properties on the Central Coast. I used to be quite heavily involved in those properties, but I found a great property manager. So I've stepped away from those properties, but those properties have been a good investment. At the time that I took them over, when I left Japan, I'd sold some properties in Japan, and I wanted to take a step back from Japan. So I took over those properties in 2011, 2012, and they weren't very well managed. And there was quite a few vacancies in there. So I had to go into those commercial properties, and they're retail and commercial, and refurbish some of those properties. I had to get rid of some of the tenants, and I had to put in new property management, and those properties are now doing very, very well. And that's also driven by demographics. The Central Coast in the last 10 years has become a lot, that real estate market has really grown. People have realised it's really close to Sydney, it's really accessible, and the residential property market on the Central Coast has really grown. So those properties have done well on the back of that, increase in population on the Central Coast.
And when you look back over however long you've been involved in property, what do you think you've learned about yourself along the way?
I've realised that there are some things that I'm very good at, probably good at sales. There's other things that I'm not so good at. I'm a bit of a plotter when it comes to development, and I'm a bit of a plotter when it comes to management. I don't have the patience for management. And I've also realised that management is, in the real estate business, it's a really unloved skill. And there are some people who are very, very good at it, who are very detail oriented, and stand back and let those guys manage. And if you've got a good manager, hang on to them, and encourage them and give them a good incentive to manage your properties properly.
And why do you think you're good at sales?
Before I started in real estate, I had a background in sales, in commercial sales and in commercial leasing, and I just enjoyed it. I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy the deal. And I was probably a little slow to get into property. When I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I didn't want to be tied down too much. So I didn't actually purchase my first property until I was about 36. I'd invested in the share market. I liked the share market because it was, quick in and quick out. But it was, so yes, I was pretty slow to get into property. But yeah, I do like this. I do like the deal. I feel I really enjoy seeing my clients do well. And I sold a property to a client in 2010, and I just contacted him recently, and he bought a property from me in Risutsu in 2010, and I think he paid about 250,000 Australian dollars for that property, and I didn't sell the property, but he sold it through Nissiko property, and I rang him up and I just said, look, can I ask you what you sold the property for? And part of the reason I do that is to really keep my finger on the pulse in Japan, because as I explained to you, it is an opaque market, and he was kind enough to tell me what he sold that property for, and he sold that property for about $2.5 million. So, that was an outstanding investment for a client, and that really, made my day. I'm just happy to see my clients do well.
Awesome. We'd all love to have those kind of deals coming across our desk, wouldn't we? And if you lost everything and had to start it all over again, what would you focus on? Good
question. I think I would continue to focus on Japanese property. I still think that there's a long way to go in Japanese property. The opportunities, there's still great opportunities around the ski resort area, around the Nissiko area. That's an area that I really know well. I've been going there for 22 years. I've been, buying property. So even though, I've talked about what I do in Lombok in a small way, and also what I do in Australia, I think if I was a young property developer and I had no capital, I would really research the hell out of Nissiko, because I think I still see bargains there every day. So that is, and that's the area that I would focus on. I think I've listened to your podcast and I've listened to what some of your developers do, but I still think that the capital growth that's available in Japan in the next 5 to 10 years, I think is going to be phenomenal. It has been phenomenal in the last 15 years, and when I invest now in Japan, I don't invest for return. I really just invest for capital growth, and I think Japan's got real capital growth potential.
And what about the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I think the best piece of advice I've ever been given was by my father, and he said he used to tell me that that no one ever got rich as an employee. And that's always been in the back of my mind. And even though I didn't really start my first business until I was in my late 30s, it wasn't until, I did my first deal that, and I got a big commission check that I realized that, that being an employee wasn't for me. And I think I've really, I'm 54 now, and I see a lot of my friends who've had careers and who are now in their 50s. And I'm increasingly seeing that if you're in your 50s now, there's, in a lot of industries and a lot of businesses, there's really no place for people in their 50s. People don't want to employ people in their 50s. They don't want to give them a career path. So, I'm very glad that, when I was in my 30s, I made that decision, not to be an employee. And I do think that I'm really seeing this new generation come through who seem to be very entrepreneurial and seem to be very skeptical about corporate life. I think is one of the great things about the current generation. We all like to write off those kids are in their 20s and 30s, but I really love seeing those young entrepreneurs who are, doing it for themselves and doing really well.
Yeah, and the other thing that's become apparent with all the virus, COVID-19 stuff that's happening across the world is that businesses can have the rug pulled out from under them and their employees get caught along with it.
Definitely, yeah. And it's been pretty tough in the real estate business in Japan and also in Australia. And I do feel, and I'm sure that there's some stories to come out of that, but I think probably there's also some great opportunities because the real estate market in Australia in a lot of areas has been very frothy. And when I look at it, over the last 10 or 11 years, I really scratch my head because it seems to me that rents have, been going down and prices have been going up, and that just seems like an elastic band that's ready to snap to me. Obviously, interest rates have continued to be low, but if there's any change in interest rates, that's all going to blow up. But I'll be very interested to see what happens in the next 5 years.
Yeah, well, I don't think interest rates are going anywhere particularly quickly in the next 3 to 5 years. I don't think the federal government can afford to let them creep up too quickly with the state that a lot of people are in.
Definitely not, Justin. So, yeah, look, I'm thanks very much for speaking with me today. And, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, then, I'm easy to find.
Well,
There's not too many Ruskin McLennans in this world.
No, it's definitely got a bit of a rock star ring to it. One last question. What's your top tip for developers out there that might be looking to take their business to the next level?
I would say, after my experience in development is be patient and take your time, and really understand the market that you are, you're going to be selling into. What I often see in Japan is developers who build stuff without talking to the local agents, and they get their pricing wrong, and they get, I guess they make a whole lot of mistakes that we've seen time and time again that really diminishes their value. So I would really, talk to you, make sure that you understand that market to the nth degree. And one of the things that we've done in Japan is in the past is we've bought, failed developers' stock and repurposed it and sold it well. So it is an opportunity. Know your market.
Very good. Well, if people want to find out more about you or about the property business that you run in Japan, where can they go looking?
They can find me on Peak Nissiko. So if you just Google Peak Nissiko, you'll find me. You'll see my website comes up there and all my details will be there. So if you already own property in Japan and you need a little bit of advice or you're looking to buy, then, please get in touch with me. And
Nissiko, how do you spell that?
Nissiko is Niseko.
Okay.
So it's just Peak Nissiko. If you put Peak Nissiko into Google, you'll see me. It's it's quite a small market up there, I can point. If I can't help you, I can certainly point you in the right direction.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to our ski trip over to Nissiko, Ruskin, where you teach me how to ski on soft powder.
Justin, I'll look forward to shouting you a soup curry and taking you for a couple of runs. We've certainly over the last 22 years, we've, introduced a lot of people to that area, and now my kids are very keen skiers as well, and they love their winters in Nissiko. So yeah, come up and have a ski with us sometime.
I look forward to it. Well, Ruskin, it's been so awesome talking to you. It's definitely a unique story, one that we haven't had before on the podcast. So it's been great to talk to you about it, and I really appreciate your time and insights.
You're welcome. Nice to talk to you too.
See you later.
Great. Bye-bye.
Okay, there you go. What an interesting journey that Ruskin has been on. I really enjoyed speaking with him about his experiences in Japan and what he has learnt along the way. Here's a couple of things I took away from the conversation. 1. You don't need to develop property in your local area. Okay, so I'm sure you understand that you don't need to develop property in your local neighbourhood. But I'm guessing the prospect of developing property in another country has probably not been at the top of your list. But it goes to show that property development opportunities can exist anywhere, including in foreign markets. So, maybe it's not that scary a thought of doing a project in another state, or even another part of the city that you live. 2. Understand your capability and risk appetite. As Ruskin found out, it was all well and good to get a permit to build a ski resort, but they didn't have the financial means or skill to physically develop the property. So he was wise enough to recognise that and bring in somebody who could take over the project. And from then on, he realised he was better suited to land subdivision and sales. This is a good reminder to be aware of what you can handle and are prepared to take on. So understand your limits and what areas of the development process you are prepared to push through. Alright, I trust you enjoyed that conversation with Ruskin. If you did, then you might want to go back and take a listen to the episodes featuring past guest Don O'Rourke, who Ruskin mentioned was the guy who came in and took over the ski resort development. Don has been on the show a few times and is well worth the time to listen to his advice and wisdom. You can go back to episodes 52 and 53 and hear Don share his tips on how he built a $1 billion developing company. Here is a taste of what you can expect with Don talking about his philosophy on pulling deals together.
Nothing is really complex. I mean, people make things out to be complex, but the principles that drive transactions are almost always very simple. So one of the things we did on that transaction, we focused on the simple pieces of commerce, and we could see a way home by doing that.
I assure you, it is worth going back and listening to Don talking about property developing. Alright, remember to email me if you are interested in learning how to develop property, justin@propertydeveloperpodcast.com, and I can send you some further info. And you can catch my project update videos on Facebook and Insta at Property Developer Podcast, plus lots of other news, views, and fun things. And as always, you can post a comment on iTunes if you're enjoying the show, and all the past episodes can be found at www.propertydeveloperpodcast.com. So, until next time.
あなたのビジネスが次のレベルに進みますように。
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas, and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.